Hi, Yaron.
So last time we kind of rebooted our discussions around Ingenuism, and we gave an overview of what it is and what the benefits are, and maybe we can be more concrete, more with examples this time. In particular, I think both of us have the last 40, 50 years have been in many ways pretty amazing. If I think about the kind of world we were born into, we're both about the same age. Robert's quite a bit younger, but about the same age. And compare it to how we live our lives today versus how our parents lived their lives back then. It's pretty astounding how much has changed and how much these kind of ingenuous ideas, implicitly, because they weren't explicit, have really brought about a revolution in the world around us.
Absolutely. I mean, if I think about what the world looked like when I was my youngest daughter's age, there were three channels and TVs were cubes and they weighed 150 pounds, and cars were expected to break down, and
They
airplanes were.
brought a computer to my classroom. I think I was in 11th or 12th grade. And all it could do was yes or no. And it depended on which light came on. It was a green light or blue or red light determined whether the answer was yes or no. But that was it. There was no video interface. There was nothing you could do. That was the first kind of.
That's how we know that you're older than I am, because
Right.
my first exposure to computers in high school, it was amazing, except you only one of them had a floppy drive. The others, you would record the programs onto cassette deck, the same
Mhm.
cassette deck that you had in music class to record. Like, it was a
Yep.
generic, and it would work about 50% of the time. So you'd have to save your program three times to make sure that one of them was actually uncorrupted. And if you just think about the power of, the phone that we carry around, versus what costs hundreds of thousands of dollars back then, that's easy to see. But it's not just Moore's law, where we've seen this improvement. We've seen it in physical structures where, at least where it's been allowed. I mean, the cars. My first car was expected to break down, and my cars now, if they broke down, I'd be like, I wouldn't even know what to do.
What's
What
going
would
on?
Yes, and of course, that's not as true for other forms of transportation. Trains, unfortunately, at least in the U.S., are largely the same, versus trains in Europe and in Asia, where they have made amazing progress. And we've had amazing progress in some areas of medicine, and other areas of medicine, it's not that different than when
Mhm.
I would go to the doctor 40 years ago. And of course, we were both in education, and we basically taught the same way that Socrates did. But some of that is because that's a method that works, and you keep doing what works. But other than replacing overhead projectors with PowerPoint, that there hasn't been a lot of change in those areas. And if you start looking at the world, like, where have things changed the most and improved the most versus where have they stagnated,
Stagnated. Yeah.
it is, where has Ingenuism been present, and where has it been and squeezed out of the system?
And so talk a little bit about how you squeeze out ingenuism, because it seems like there's a sense in which we're kind of naturally inclined towards thinking in terms of ingenuism, and we engage in that activity when available. So what does it mean to squeeze it out?
Well, it definitely takes something to remove what we call a supportive environment, because if you drop people into the jungle, they start experimenting and figuring things out. So because their survival depends on it. So it's a combination of incentives and the opportunity to create and use feedback loops. And if you look at these areas where there's been enormous progress made, there's also been lots of mistakes made along the way. We don't talk about them, and over time they sort of fall out of the history. But every great advance, there were a bunch of efforts that didn't go anywhere. So having the incentives and the opportunity to explore and discover new things is what really separates. And we
Mhm.
call that a supportive environment because we don't have a single word for it. But if you think about it in general, it really depends on how, and we talked about this last week, how top down the company or the university or the government really is versus how much it gives people freedom to try and fail and learn and really make progress.
Yeah, and it's so easy. Sadly, human history is filled really with environments that are not supportive. Whether it's because we fear the other, so we limit connection, or whether it's we fear the unknown, so we limit exploration. And maybe one of the best examples of that in the U.S. is the nuclear power industry, which has had so much potential, and basically today, in spite of our massive need for what's called clean energy and massive need for energy, particularly as we'll talk about in a minute with AI, you need huge amounts of electricity and electric cars and everything. There's just nothing happening on the nuclear energy front, unfortunately, in the US.
Yeah, that always makes me sad to think about because nuclear power's heyday was at that same time when I was young, and all these other things like cars is the best example because a car is is very complicated. The early cars, if you go back, cars had gotten when they started out. So if you go back 100 years, it's hard to imagine just how different cars were. They were this amazing new thing because they were a motorized vehicle. But there's a house in San Jose that was developed fairly early, so it's 100 years old, where the garage, there's a ramp you drive in the back, and then there's a ramp you go out the front because you would drive the car in, park it, and then you would push it and go down the ramp to
Couldn't
start it.
do, couldn't, yeah, that's right. You couldn't do, couldn't reverse it. Yeah.
And there were cranks, and there were like all these crazy
Yeah.
things, but that was, you think about that, it's like, oh yeah, that was in olden times,
Yeah.
as my
100
daughter
years.
likes to say. But in my lifetime we've seen cars which had got very complicated, so they got even less, even as they got better, they got less reliable, uh, become incredibly reliable. And if you saw the same thing happen over the last 50 years in nuclear power, you'd basically be imagining, what's the difference between, a 1970 Fiat versus a 2024 Lexus. They would be incredibly reliable and incredibly powerful, and we haven't seen any of that. So it is
No, and of course,
really disappointing.
everything that makes possible, which is, if you make electricity unbelievably reliable and unbelievably plentiful and relatively cheap, a lot of other innovations happen just because of that.
And you could eliminate poverty. People talk about eliminating poverty, and we've basically done it in the US, but in on the globe, we've made a lot of progress, but it has not happened. And you could have the same level of wealth in Africa as we have in the US today, and in the US we do, have our flying cars.
Yep. Yes. So, one of the, I think, most exciting innovations happening right now, where you really see Ingenuism play a role, is in artificial intelligence. And just over the last, 2 years, year and a half, we've seen massive strides. There's still issues, there's still problems. There will always be, but the improvement is dramatic. And so, how do you think Ingenuism plays a role in the development of AI and kind of AI's future?
Well, AI is super interesting because AI as a concept has been around for a long, long time. First as a science fiction concept, but there have been people working on developing machine intelligence for decades and decades before we saw any real progress. And most of the efforts, and you even see this in science fiction, if you read old science fiction, it's some sort of mapping that you put into a computer program. So you have a rabbit, and then everything around a rabbit gets a score. So um, if like a carrot would get a high score, while a rock would get a low score. So it would start associating rabbits with the same things that humans associate them with, and that went nowhere. And there were proposals about neural networks, but basically, although it turns out that conceptually that was the right way to go, there wasn't enough computer power because essentially the neural network lets some mass of data tell you those scores instead of them having to be assigned in advance. So the original work was very top down. We're going to tell the machine what's important about everything and have links between them, versus what's actually worked, which has been very bottoms up. Just, give it 100 trillion tokens of training data and let it figure out what those different relationships should be. And that is essentially, at a very simple, oversimplified level, but essentially what a LLM is doing is it's learning what we've originally tried to put into the program. It's now learning on its own. So it's very ingenuous, not just the progress we've made in LLMs, but the way that LLMs work. It's exploring this data, discovering the patterns, and then over time learning more about which of those patterns are actually relevant and useful to the user.
Yeah. And it's only going to get better, which is fascinating. It does require enormous amounts of computing power. So there's massive investment going on right now in these massive data centers. So Amazon, Microsoft, Google, Apple, everybody's investing huge amounts of money in the data centers, and then that's going to require electricity, which brings it back to the nuclear. A huge amounts of electricity to power these data centers, and then all this requires new chips and new designs for chips, which is why NVIDIA is doing so well, because NVIDIA had, by accident, really, they were designing graphics chips, and it turns out those are optimized for AI. But now it seems like everybody's building AI chips or designing AI chips. Only TSMC actually builds them, but everybody designs them, and everybody's designing their own chips. So there's going to be massive competition for AI chips, which is going to generate increases, and the upside seems amazing here.
Well, it'll be interesting, right? Because that's the thing with exploration and discovery is you never know. Like if we use the map analogy, you get off the map, so you're going down this valley, and it could be a pass to the other side of the mountains and new lands that you've never seen before, with amazing things and opportunities and resources, and or eventually it ends up running into a mountain, and it's a valley, it's not a pass, and you have to start looking for another way. And there is no other way to do it. It's not like you can figure out which is, as you get over the horizon, which is going to actually go through. And of course, discovering a huge valley is not as good as discovering a pass to a completely new land, but it's still pretty damn good. So this is nothing against what's going on right now. And right now, we have these large language models, which are amazing. They keep making better, and they'll make more efficient. And they all share a distinction that keeps them from, being what we've imagined a real useful AI is, or what Jarvis is for Tony Stark, is that they are connecting you to existing knowledge inside of their training data, and you can be pretty sophisticated in terms of pointing it to what you really want, and that's just usually called the context of the model. So whatever you put into the window that you initially prompt the model with, you can put a lot in there. And of course, that itself is something that is in the middle of being improved, because right now you can put tons in there. You couldn't do that 2 years ago.
Yeah.
But what you put into the context window, the model seems to weigh more heavily what's at the beginning and at the end. It's interesting because that's the same bias that people have. If I'm on a long soliloquy here, the only thing people remember is what I said at the beginning and at the end. But the context window is what the model is working on, and even if it's huge, like you were to feed in all of the writings of Yaron Brook and all of his podcasts and all of the things, and make and get a response that really is what you would say, the next time you open the model, all of that is gone. So the lack of memory, as it were, in LLMs. Now we could train a model to be Yaron LLM.
Yeah.
And then it would stay, because that would change the way that, by using that data, it would change the way that the different things are linked together. A rabbit and a carrot get a high score, and Yaron and free markets get a high score, higher than the average person would get with that. So that's a different thing, and that would be very interesting. But what we've got right now is basically a way to query, get an answer, and then start the next query from scratch. And without that memory, we won't have Jarvis. It's just that we
Yep.
need, and it may be that we don't end up with memory, but we actually train models. Everyone has their own trained model
Hmm.
that they carry around in their phone, which would be pretty amazing. But we
Well,
really
and
don't know
Apple
how
is
that's
cutting
going
a
to
deal
go.
with OpenAI to put it on your phone. So supposedly iOS 18 will have AI on the phone.
And if it's a model that's put on and everyone gets the same model, which presumably they will,
Yep.
and it doesn't evolve, then it's not going to be that
Yeah.
interesting.
It needs
But
to be customized to you, right?
if it can evolve and then become more valuable over time, that's where it gets really interesting. And then there are all sorts of questions like, okay, now you've got this evolved model. Do you own it? Does Apple own it?
Yeah.
What what is
Who owns Euron?
yeah. And once we replace Huron, and there's a bunch of Huron AI shows going on, is that legal? If it's not Huron who's doing it, if I'm doing it, like it's going to be really interesting, and that of course concerns you and I both, because we see AI bills being written at both the federal and the state
Yeah.
level
Yeah.
that are exactly the opposite of what Ingenuism would argue for. Ingenuism says try 1,000 little things now when you can figure out what works and what doesn't work and learn. Don't restrict the the opportunity to experiment now. Only do that if there becomes some clear reason in the future, because we have to acknowledge that there are people concerned that AI is going to go bad and kill everybody. Uh, that's something that you would want to discover right as the hardware is not powerful enough to, in the same way that you couldn't use a neural network until the hardware is powerful enough. You'd want to discover that when it's all virtual and you have a machine intelligence that's stuck in the machine and doesn't have, robot factories and robot soldiers and all the other things that it might need.
So I've actually been approached by a company startup to create a clone of Euron. So they want access to all my podcasts. They want access to my books. They said if you've got notes, anything you can give that, and
Everything,
and then the clone, they're talking about actually video and voice.
of course. Yep.
And yes, I've been saying on my podcast that in the future, they won't even know if it's me or if it's my clone. And we'll actually have competitions about who can identify, is this a show being done by? So it's going to be fascinating. I haven't read the contract yet. They just approached me and they sent me a contract. So I have to read the contract because a lot of it's going to be the fine print about, okay, you
Who
produce the clone, but
owns
who
the
owns this
clone?
clone? Because
Yes.
I really do want to own it. I don't want you owning my clone. That's spooky.
And when we notice that the Yaron Brook show is going 24/7, we'll be like, oh, wait a minute. I
When
knew there was a reason it got so much better. Uh, yes, and
yeah,
that's exactly. I didn't know that. That's really
just
interesting,
happened.
because
Yeah, it just
that's
happened.
that's the logical next step. And what you're getting is someone who will speak and answer and respond, all the things like you to
Yep.
input. But then it's not very far to have something that will predict your needs, desires, do
Yeah.
all the things that the assistant would be set up to do.
Yes, I'm still that is more that's more this is kind of more insider, right? So all it needs to know is about me. The next step is it needs to know about my preferences in the world out there, and then needs to be able to navigate the world out there. And that is a whole other level of complexity, I think, in terms of being able to go and choose a hotel and choose a flight based on knowing what I would probably do. But that's hard. Now you're talking about
And not screw up and not send
Yes.
you to San Jose, Costa
Yep.
Rica instead of San Jose, California.
On a red eye coach.
And it is a legitimate, and when you're trying to do basically a deep fake of Yaron, really mimic Yaron, both what he's going to say, how he's going to respond, and what you look like, what you sound like. That's super interesting. But it is one of these enclosed
Yep.
models, and having it be more engaged with the world and able to respond to new situations. That'll be interesting. The new models come out and you always play with it, kind of see like, okay, how does it really respond to the things that would have tripped it up 6 months or a year ago? So like one of the early things that I tried to trip up the model and it would trip them up is, how much pain can a bear? And now a model respond with, it seems like this is a play on words for the words bear and bear, and then we'll give some answers about physical pain versus emotional,
Okay.
like gives a good answer, like is
Yep.
a human like answer. But if you ask a model, what, tell me something that you don't know, which is really ingenuism in an essence. Finding out what you don't know is connection, and um, then there's finding out what you don't know, that it doesn't, you find out nobody knows it, there's no answer, then you go out and you find that answer. That's exploration, or that's discovery. And then exploration is finding the questions that you haven't even thought of yet. And when you ask an LLM, tell me some things you don't know, it gives you a list of things that it doesn't know, which I guess is encouraging for me in terms of the world surviving another year.
Yeah, I'm not. I have my doubts about the word surviving, but they don't focus on AI. So,
Yeah, we both
uh,
think that AI is more likely to be help us survive things that we don't
I
even know we
think
should
that's right.
worry about than
Yep.
killing us all.
Yeah. And one of the things that I like is that there's a lot of competition now in AI. Elon Musk just raised $6 billion for his AI venture. All the major companies obviously doing it, but there are also a bunch of other startups. And I think seeing that it's not just dominated by one company or one entity, certainly that it's not dominated by government is I think a very positive thing and exciting about the future.
Yes, and then that layer on top of it, because that's really where the value will come. I mean,
Mhm.
it's like when we talked about those first computers, we saw that not only could they not do anything, but you had to program them in DOS. And then you moved up to basic, and but it was very difficult to interact with them even when they started to become powerful. You had to be a specialist and really be trained to be able to interact with them. And now kids, they turn on a computer, they just expect it to work. It's
Yep.
like turning
Yep.
on the television or turning on the lights. It's just there. And that's because of all the work that's been done on the interface, and that is what would again, we get back to our agent. We've been talking about our agent for 4 or 5 years now. uh,
Well, but we're getting closer. Definitely getting closer.
It'll be one of those things that it like the language models, it's not possible, and then it'll be possible, and suddenly it'll be real, and it'll get better. But it's like, going from riding a horse to having the car, and it may take a long time before you have a Ferrari, but it's that first step that really makes a difference. And it is exciting that we may have made that first step in terms of machine intelligence. We won't know for a couple of years whether we get past what the current trajectory can make possible. um, but way more is possible than was even 2 years ago.
Yeah, I think it's super exciting, and it's something that is going to evolve quite a bit in the next few years. Something we're going to be monitoring here when we talk about Ingenuism, because those are the principles that are at work, whether they identify them or not. This is what is at work on a regular basis.
What I'd really like to see is a Yaron clone talking to a Robert clone and just see where they go.
Scary stuff,
Yeah.
but all doable.
Yeah,
Seems like
probably they just
seems
start
like
giving each other crap. If we had all of our past
if
interactions,
if
they
they're
just start
trained
giving
on
crap.
everything we've ever interacted, yes.
Yeah.
I think that's right. I think we'd filter out some of our interactions.
Probably need
Some
to.
of them were not recorded. All right. We will continue this to be continued next week.
Thanks, Yaron.
Bye, Robert.
Bye.